I'm Kentrell Owens. I'm a PhD student at the University of Washington, advised by Franziska, Roesner, and Tadayoshi Kohno. Today I'm talking about some work we did in collaboration with the legal scholar, Anita, Alem, on electronic monitoring smartphone apps. And first I'm going to give an example to motivate how someone might come to use one of these apps. So imagine you're at a protest, you're having a good time exercising your right to organize in the US, and then someone standing next to you throws something at the police, say a rock or like a Pepsi or something, right? And then the police all of a sudden rush over to you, grab you and 5 other people near you, right? And you're arrested and you're taken to jail, right? And within 24 hours, you have your arraignment, some court date, you go before a judge and you say to the judge, I didn't do this, it wasn't me, somebody else. I didn't have a Pepsi that day. And the judge says, well, one of the police officers said it was you. We got to look at the body camera footage. Your court date's in a month. And so I'll release you now until your court date. But instead of the traditional cash bail that we used to have, say it would be $10,000, we're giving you an app. And you have to install this app on your phone, and you have to do check-ins, and you have to have a good relationship with your release supervisor. And if you fail to do the check-ins properly, you could be incarcerated and brought back to jail. So do you accept these conditions? And of course, you, as the security and privacy researcher, you're very concerned about this. You're like, what is this app doing? What data does it collect? Who does it send the data to? But you of course, accept, and you're released. And these apps are real. They're a new form of electronic monitoring. Electronic monitoring is a subset of community supervision. Community supervision is either an alternative to being incarcerated or after someone is released from being incarcerated. So for example, probation, parole, release from immigrant or juvenile detention, and in this example I mentioned, release from pretrial detention. And normally people who are under community supervision, they must comply with several conditions, such as curfews, visits, drug tests, supervision fees. So often people who are under community supervision have to pay fees for their supervision. And historically, this technology used for electronic monitoring has been ankle monitors. And ankle monitors are still used, and their use is actually still growing. But in addition to ankle monitors, there are smartphone apps that are being rolled out for people under community supervision. And it's really hard to get numbers on these, specifically app usage. But the biggest public numbers we could find were usage by ICE for immigration detection. So right now, around 100,000 people are using these smartphone apps after being released from immigration detention. And the second largest number we could find publicly available was being used for probation by Virginia state prisons, around a little bit over 10,000 people. Right, and so these apps are primarily used for checking in with one supervisor, as I mentioned. This could either be in lieu or in addition to traditional in-person meetings that happen with the supervisor under community supervision. And these check-ins might require you to have your location enabled. There might be some face and voice recognition involved. And if you're part of some drug treatment program, you might have to use like a Bluetooth breathalyzer, for example, as part of these check-ins. And so there's an image on the left that shows an example of what a check-in looks like for one of these apps that we looked at. So this check-in specifically requires you hold the phone in front of you, you have your front camera on, you read off a series of randomly generated numbers, and you have to do that within a certain period of time, right? And so that's one example of what a check-in could look like. And as I mentioned before, failure to successfully check in can lead to incarceration. It really depends a lot on your supervisor. Sometimes it might just take one failure, sometimes it might take multiple. But yeah, this could lead to your going back to jail. So this is you can kind of recognize that this might be a problem here. There are these high-stake apps can result in you being incarcerated that have been audited to evaluate their data practices or what privacy myths they may introduce to the people who use them, right? And so based on this, we had several research questions about these apps. Primarily, first, what are the experiences and concerns of people coerced to use these apps? And we answered this research question through qualitative analysis of reviews in the Google Play Store. Secondly, we wanted to know what the privacy-related technical properties of these apps were. And so to answer this question, we did some static and limited dynamic analysis of these apps. We found 16 Android apps in total that are currently being used for electronic monitoring. We also did a case study of the least and most privileged apps. I say limited dynamic analysis because to use these apps, you need to get credentials to log into them, and those credentials come from your supervisors. So since we weren't actually using the apps, we didn't have credentials to log into them. So all of our analysis is pre-authentication. We still had some interesting findings that I'll talk about a bit later. Do these apps' privacy policies align with our observations? So what we saw in our technical analysis is that reflected in the privacy policies. And of course, we answered this question through qualitative analysis of the app's privacy policies. And what legal protections, if any, exist for people under electronic monitoring. And we collaborated with a legal scholar to answer this question. Because the time is limited today, I'm going to focus on the first research question and the case studies from the second research question. But of course, for more details, you can see the paper. So before that, some ethical considerations, right? We saw IRB approval for the study and we were deemed exempt, but despite that, we followed best practices for conducting research with publicly available information. When we started analyzing the privacy policies for these apps, we noticed that 7 out of the 16 didn't have adequate privacy policies up that follow Google Play Store's policies. So either the privacy policy didn't exist there, or the privacy policies didn't mention the apps at all. And so we reached out to these companies, we notified them that we're gonna let Google know in a month if they're in violation of these policies. One of the companies, after we reached out, corrected and added information about the apps into their policies, but the rest didn't respond. And we reached out to Google in early summer. So to our results, what are the experiences and concerns of people who are coerced to use these apps? From analyzing the reviews, a common issue that we found was that there are malfunctions with these apps that prevent people from successfully performing check-ins. Right? And as I mentioned before, these check-ins are a requirement of using these apps. And these malfunctions were typically caused by failures in facial or voice recognition systems or location failures. So for example, people said when they wanted to do a check-in and they were wearing a mask, they had to take their mask off, or if they were wearing makeup sometimes, the phone wouldn't recognize them. Similarly, people mentioned just being asleep and then the phone's location, I guess detection system was off and they were woken up in the middle of the night by alarms saying that they'd gone outside of a zone that they weren't supposed to be in. Similarly, these apps caused disruption for people. There were these loud alerts that overrid their phone's volume settings and often set their volume to max, even if they're wearing headphones. People talked about how these apps could consume significant battery and space. One of the reviews said specifically that the app consumed battery on their phone so quickly that they had to buy an external battery pack and carry it around so that the phone wouldn't die and they wouldn't get in trouble. And lastly, reviews mentioned that these apps cause operating system crashes and freezes, which is particularly concerning. As we know, one requirement of using these apps is that they're available all the time so that your supervisor can see what you're doing. And if these apps themselves cause the phone to crash, you could be setting people up for failure. People describe a general sense of injustice in some of the reviews. I have one quote here that I'm going to read in full. There's a lot more great quotes in the paper. I hope you have a chance to look at it. This person says, "I'm a drug court client in phase 5. I've been in the program over a year, done very well. I'm worried about this app. It does not work very well. The developers should be ashamed of themselves. This is my sobriety and freedom that's at stake. This app has the ability to destroy all I've worked so hard for. Please fix it or takes it down. Your money is not worth my freedom." So now onto our case studies of the least and most privileged app and what are their privacy properties. In the study, we found that the most privileged app was Sprocket and the least privileged app was UpTrust. So here's a screenshot on the right from Sprocket, one of the app that we found to be the most privileged. It says like no tracking, but our results kind of differ from that. Sprocket requested the most runtime permission, also known as dangerous permissions, out of all the apps that we looked at. It had the most third-party libraries out of any of the apps we looked at, 9, including ad libraries, which can be concerning because it might imply that someone's profiting from people being coerced to use these apps. And lastly, Sprocket was the only app we observed pre-authentication that had time-driven requests. So they sent data to Facebook every 5 minutes. Now this data was generally general device information such as battery, amount of space you have, if the device is rooted or not, et cetera. But it's still surprising that some apps had time-driven. This was the only app that had time-driven requests pre-authentication. On the other hand, UpTrust was the least privileged app we saw. Requested 0 runtime or dangerous permissions. Had 3 third-party libraries, and on their website they specifically say they don't geolocate or have a user-funded model, meaning that people who use the app don't have to pay for it. So, looking forward, right, these EM apps, they introduce new harms and risks to the people required to use them. There are few limits on what these apps can do from a legal perspective. We expand on these 2 points a lot in the paper. But their proliferation is not inevitable. There are these municipalities around the country that are banning other forms of carceral technologies, right? And I think app marketplaces definitely have a role to play in this. So for example, Google Play, they block certain types of apps from being on their platform. So apps that block ads or apps that help people cheat at games if they wanted to. They consider blocking EM apps, or if not blocking them entirely, they can consider increasing transparency requirements for these apps because they're so high stakes. And I think computer science researchers can do a lot of good in this space, and I'll expand on this point more. So there's lots of other forms of carceral technologies that are impacting people. There's these ankle monitors, of course, but there's also wearables for recidivism prediction. There's mental health prediction tools. I think because as security and privacy researcher, we have these reversing skills. We can audit technologies. We can collaborate with legal scholars, policymakers, community organizations to try to figure out how to help reduce the harms of technology and potentially make technology that helps people. And although it isn't necessary to understand how things work in detail to understand the potential harm they could cause, I think it's very helpful. So thank you for your time.